"If you can map this lost river, I'll hand you the last gold claim," dared the railroad tycoon to the prospector. The morning sun spilled over the dusty main street of Whitlock Junction, turning the new steel tracks into a ribbon of fire. Men in bowler hats and women in Sunday dresses gathered near the freshly painted train station, their voices low with curiosity. At the center of the platform, standing as if the entire West belonged to him, was Horace Blackwell. His black coat shone with the richness of imported fabric, his gold watch chain swayed with each measured movement, and his eyes held the kind of cold confidence only a man who owned railroads could carry. On the wooden steps of the station, Horace raised a folded piece of parchment high enough for all to see. His voice carried with the authority of a man used to being obeyed. "If any man in this territory can map the lost river before my line reaches the mountains, I will hand him the last gold claim in the district." The crowd murmured, some laughing at the impossibility, others whispering about the fortune such a claim might hold. At the back of the gathering, leaning against a hitching post, stood Elias Boone. The years had carved deep lines into his sunburned face, and his hair was the color of dry sage. Once his name had been spoken with admiration among miners, but those days were buried under years of bad luck and too many false leads. Yet, as Horace spoke, Elias straightened, his eyes narrowing at the mention of the river. The lost river was no myth to him. He had heard its name from the cracked lips of a dying man in a snowbound cabin 20 years ago. A river that vanished into the earth only to reappear miles away in a hidden canyon, carrying gold as pure as the morning light. Elias had searched once, long ago, and failed, but now with the claim of a lifetime dangling before him, the old hunger stirred. Horace's gaze swept the crowd until it landed on Elias. He smiled faintly, recognizing the old prospector. "Well, Boone, do you still know how to read a map, or are your eyes too clouded by dust?" Laughter rippled through the bystanders, but Elias didn't flinch. "I'll find your river, Blackwell," he said, his voice low but steady. "And when I hand you the map, I expect the deed signed in my name." Horace stepped down from the platform, close enough for Elias to smell the faint scent of cigar smoke on his coat. "If you can map it before my engineers reach the canyon, the claim is yours. But fail, and every man will know you as the fool who chased shadows." The challenge hung in the air, like the ringing of a hammer on steel. Elias tipped his hat and walked away, already feeling the weight of the trail ahead. He knew the mountains would test his bones, the river would test his mind, and Horace Blackwell would test his pride. As the crowd broke apart, some shook their heads in pity, others in awe. No one had found the lost river in decades, but Elias Boone, with nothing left to lose and everything to gain, would ride out at dawn. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the river waited, and with it, perhaps, the last chance he would ever have to change his fortune. Elias Boone sat alone at his small camp table, the glow of a single oil lamp casting shadows on the weathered canvas walls of his tent. Outside, the murmurs of the town faded with the night air, replaced by the distant hum of crickets and the occasional whistle of a night train. The parchment map Horace Blackwell had waved that morning lay rolled up beside him, untouched. His attention was fixed on a much older, much more fragile piece of paper, one he had carried for over 2 decades. It was a page torn from a dying man's journal. The handwriting was shaky, the ink blurred by time and weather, but the words still spoke with an urgency that pulled at Elias even now. It told of a river that disappeared beneath the ground and re-emerged in a hidden canyon, where the banks glittered with nuggets the size of a man's thumb. The writer had never reached it himself. Fever had taken him before the spring thaw, leaving Elias with nothing but a story and a hunger that had never quite faded. On the far edge of the table sat another clue, a leather-bound journal with the name Henry Maddox embossed on its cover. Maddox had been a cartographer hired to survey the mountains 20 years ago. He never returned, and his disappearance became another whispered ghost story among miners. Elias had purchased the journal from a traveling trader who claimed it was found in the ruins of an old supply cabin. The pages were filled with half-finished sketches and strange symbols, drawn in a way that hinted at a code. Elias traced one symbol with a calloused finger, a spiral etched beside a crude drawing of a ridge. He didn't know its meaning, but he knew someone who might. Clara Porter, the schoolteacher and daughter of a respected surveyor, had a knack for reading old markings. Her father had mapped much of the territory before the railroads came, and Clara had inherited his keen eye for detail. He remembered seeing her that morning, standing at the back of the crowd, her brow furrowed as Blackwell spoke. Clara was not one for foolish ventures, but she had the mind of a puzzle solver, and this was a puzzle that might tempt her curiosity. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the lamplight flickering against the canvas. The legend of the lost river was no longer just a whisper in his mind. It had been spoken aloud in the center of town, thrown into the open like a gauntlet. Men would be preparing even now, not just honest prospectors, but scavengers, outlaws, and fortune hunters willing to bleed the mountains dry to get there first. His thoughts turned to the one man he hoped not to see on this journey, Silas Kincaid. Once a partner, now an enemy, Silas had made his name by stealing claims from better men and leaving them to rot in the wilderness. If the promise of the last gold claim reached his ears, Elias knew Silas would follow, and Silas never followed without bringing trouble. Elias closed the journal, blew out the lamp, and lay down on his narrow cot. Sleep did not come easily. In his mind, the river's waters flowed like molten gold, winding through the shadows of a canyon no one had mapped. Somewhere out there, the trail waited, and with it every danger the mountains could conjure. By dawn, he would be ready to ride. The next morning broke clear and sharp, the sky washed in a pale blue that promised a dry, hot day ahead. Elias Boone walked with purpose toward the schoolhouse at the edge of town. The building was small, painted white, with a tall bell tower that had weathered more than one harsh winter. Children's laughter carried faintly on the wind from the playground behind it, but Elias kept his eyes on the open door where Clara Porter stood, shaking chalk dust from her hands. Clara was a woman of precise movements, her dark hair pinned neatly, her posture straight as if her spine were a rule she had never dared to bend. She spotted Elias approaching and crossed her arms, already anticipating that his visit had nothing to do with the education of children. "You need something," she said, her tone clipped but not unkind. "I do," Elias replied, holding out the leather-bound journal of Henry Maddox. "Thought you might be the only person in this town who could make sense of these." Clara took the book, her brow furrowing as she turned the pages. Her fingers paused over the strange spiral symbol Elias had studied the night before. She glanced up at him, curiosity sharpening her gaze. "This isn't random. My father used a similar mark when mapping underground water routes. It means there's a natural sinkhole or cavern system." Elias leaned closer. "And if a river ran into one, it might disappear from the surface entirely," Clara said slowly, her mind working through the puzzle. "If the river you're after vanishes, this could tell us where it goes." She closed the journal gently, as if sealing a thought inside. "But why bring this to me? Because you're the only one I trust to read it right. And because I think you might enjoy the chase," Elias said with a faint smile. Clara studied him for a moment, the corner of her mouth twitching as if she fought the urge to smile back. Then her expression hardened. "You realize others will be looking for this river too. Dangerous men. I've met dangerous men," Elias said. "You're still breathing," she replied, handing the journal back. "That's something." After a pause, Clara picked up a satchel from inside the schoolhouse and slung it over her shoulder. "If I'm going to help, I'll need my own notes and equipment. My father's old compass, too. We leave before the sun's high." Elias nodded, relief washing over him. He had expected to argue, to persuade. Instead, Clara had stepped into the journey with the quiet decisiveness of someone who understood the stakes. As they walked toward the general store to gather supplies, Elias kept scanning the street. He knew the kind of men who would be listening for word of his plans. And sure enough, in the shadow of the livery stable, a figure shifted. Broad-shouldered, hat pulled low, the man stood half-hidden. But Elias didn't need to see the whole face to know it was Silas Kincaid. Silas watched them for a long moment, his posture relaxed in a way that was more dangerous than any outright threat. Then he turned and disappeared into the alley. Elias said nothing to Clara, but his mind tightened like a fist. The race for the Lost River had already begun, and the first clue was theirs. By the time Elias and Clara left the general store, the sun had climbed high enough to bake the dusty street into a pale haze. They moved with quiet purpose, each carrying bundles of supplies wrapped in canvas. Flour, beans, salt pork, coil after coil of sturdy rope, and a few tin boxes of matches. Elias balanced the heavier load without complaint, though his mind kept circling back to the figure he had seen by the livery stable. They crossed to the blacksmith's shop to check the horses Elias had arranged to rent. 2 sturdy bay geldings stood in the shade, tails swishing lazily, their saddles already fitted. Clara moved to inspect them with the same methodical care she gave to her books, running a hand along each flank, checking the shoes, the reins, the stitching on the saddlebags. Elias glanced toward the far end of the street, and there he was. Silas Kincaid stepped into view, his tall frame cutting a sharp line against the sunlit buildings. His coat was dust-streaked from travel, but the glint of the revolver on his hip was unmistakable. "Well now, Boone," Silas called, his voice carrying easily over the clatter of the blacksmith's hammer. "You still chasing fairy tales, or did the years finally knock some sense into you?" Clara straightened, her gaze flicking between them. "You know him?" she asked quietly. "Too well," Elias murmured. Silas strolled closer, the slow, deliberate walk of a man who knew he owned the ground under his boots. "Word is, you're after the Lost River, and word travels fast, especially when there's gold at the end." Elias met his eyes without flinching. "You've got your own trails to follow." Silas's smile was thin, humorless. "Trouble is, I've always had a taste for yours." The air between them tightened, and Clara stepped forward just enough to make her presence known. "We're leaving in an hour," she said evenly. "If you've come to trade threats, you've wasted the walk." Silas gave her a long, unreadable look, then tipped his hat. "I like her spirit, Boone. Shame she'll be carrying gear for a dead man before this is over." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving the street buzzing with whispers. Elias knew Silas well enough to understand that the man never spoke without intent. If he said he was going after the same goal, he meant to take it, and to make the path there as hard as possible. Once Silas was gone from sight, Clara adjusted the strap of her satchel. "That man doesn't bluff, does he?" "No," Elias said, tightening the cinch on his horse's saddle. "Which means we ride now." Within minutes they were mounted, the town shrinking behind them as they headed toward the rolling hills. The air smelled of sun-warmed sage, and the horizon shimmered with heat. Yet even in the wide openness of the land, Elias couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Somewhere behind them, Silas Kincaid would be setting his own course, waiting for the moment to strike. The hunt for the Lost River was no longer just a test of skill. It was a race, and the other rider on the trail would rather see Elias buried in the canyon than watch him win. They stopped only once, before leaving the last trace of Whitlock Junction behind, at the weathered barn of Thomas Avery, an old friend of Elias's from his earliest days in the goldfields. Thomas was mending a wagon wheel when they arrived, his shoulders stooped but still broad, his hands steady with the hammer. "Elias, I heard about Blackwell's little spectacle," Thomas said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You really mean to chase the Lost River again?" "I do," Elias replied, swinging down from his horse. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You've always been stubborn enough to follow a ghost, but you'd better remember the mountains don't care about stubborn men." While Elias saw to the tightening of saddle straps, Clara dismounted and walked toward the well at the edge of the property. She filled their canteens, the rope creaking as the bucket rose and fell. Thomas watched her with quiet curiosity, then leaned closer to Elias. "She knows what she's riding into?" "She knows enough," Elias said. Thomas's gaze hardened. "Then make sure she knows more. These ridges have teeth, Elias. They'll chew up the unprepared." Inside the barn, Elias rummaged through an old chest Thomas kept for travelers in need. From it, he selected a weatherproof oilskin tarp, a pair of heavy gloves, and a coil of climbing rope, thicker than the one he'd bought in town. Clara found a canvas pouch filled with her father's brass instruments, compass, calipers, and a folding spyglass. As the sun dipped lower, Thomas led them to the gate. "I'll say one thing for you, Elias. If the lost river's out there, you'll find it. But you'll be finding more than gold." Elias smiled faintly. "I reckon that's always the way." Before mounting, Clara turned to Thomas. "Thank you for the water and supplies." He tipped his hat to her. "Keep your eyes open, Miss Porter. Trust the map, trust your gut, and trust him, though he's got more scars than good sense." They rode out, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. The road narrowed into a trail that wound between low hills where the grass swayed in a restless breeze. Far behind them, a single rider appeared for a heartbeat at the crest of a ridge before vanishing again into the folds of the land. Elias didn't need to guess who it was. As the first stars appeared, they made camp near a stand of cottonwoods beside a shallow stream. Clara lit the fire while Elias unpacked their food, the silence between them broken only by the pop of sap in the flames. "You've done this 100 times, Clara said, glancing at the neat way he stacked their supplies. "Not for a long while," Elias replied, "and never with someone else's safety in my hands." Clara didn't answer, but her expression softened in the firelight. In that unspoken moment, Elias felt the weight of the trail ahead settle more heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just his quest anymore. It was theirs. Dawn rose, pale and clean, the kind of light that made the sagebrush glow silver and the distant hills look younger than they were. Elias roused the fire with a handful of dry twigs, while Clara folded their blankets with an economy of motion that told him she would never be the one to slow the party. The horses nickered, ears swiveling toward the stream, and a pair of sandhill cranes lifted from the reeds with heavy, graceful wings. They broke camp without ceremony. Clara took the lead across the shallow ford, testing each step before the geldings committed their weight. Beyond the cottonwoods, the land opened like a book, pages of grassland turned by a steady wind. Elias let the rhythm of the ride settle into his bones as he watched Clara work. She kept her father's compass tethered to her belt and the Maddox journal tucked beneath her arm, opening it only when a ridgeline or stone outcrop suggested a match to the sketched symbols. By mid-morning they reached a rise and reined in. From there, the earth fell away into miles of broken country, braided arroyos, pockets of juniper, and the faint, coppery thread of a dry creek curling toward a darker line of mesas far to the west. Clara lifted the spyglass and scanned the horizon. "Those mesas might be the same ones Maddox drew," she said quietly. "Look at the notch cut into the northern face." Elias shaded his eyes, following her direction. "I see it, like a missing tooth." "Exactly." She knelt and pressed the journal against her knee, sketching the view with quick, clean strokes. "If the river vanishes, it will do it where the limestone turns to karst. These low swales could be sinks. We should skirt them and aim for higher ground." They angled southwest, keeping to the spines of low ridges where the wind blew clean and their tracks would be harder to read. Still, Elias looked back more often than the land required. A tightness hung at the base of his neck, the familiar prickle that told him eyes were on his back. Once, at a stretch of soft sand, he dismounted and knelt, tracing an overlapping stamp of hoof and heel. The heel was sharp, unscuffed, too tidy for a drifter. He brushed it away with the side of his hand before Clara could see. The sun climbed and the heat became a weight. They rationed their water with care. In the hottest hour, they gave the horses shade beneath a slab of overhanging rock and ate quietly. A strip of salt pork, a biscuit warmed on the flat of a pan, a wedge of dried apple that tasted sweeter than it should have. "Why did you stop searching for the river?" Clara asked at last. "If the story meant so much to you?" Elias took a breath that was longer than it needed to be. "Men who chase one thing too long forget everything else. I buried a partner because I would not turn back from a storm. After that, I started turning back too soon." Clara regarded him without pity, which he appreciated. "Then this time you will not be too early or too late." He smiled at that. "That would suit me fine." They rode again as the light softened. In a narrow draw, the horses shied, and Elias spotted the cause. A rattlesnake coiled in the warm dust, head lifted. He took a long branch and eased it aside, murmuring to the geldings until the tension left their bodies. When the trail widened, they found a cairn of stones at the base of a chalky bluff. Someone had cut a spiral into a fist-sized rock and set it on top. Clara's breath caught. "Maddox." She brushed the spiral clean with the side of her hand. "This mark matches the one for a sink. If his route is right, there should be a dry swallow hole within a quarter mile." They found it at the bend of a shallow ravine, a round depression where the ground sagged as if the earth had exhaled. Scrub roots threaded the chalk, and the air felt a shade cooler near its rim. Clara knelt, tapping the soil with the handle of her knife. The sound turned hollow. "There is a cavity beneath," she said. "If the river disappears, it goes down through networks like this." Elias crouched beside her and placed his palm to the ground. He imagined a dark channel below, a hidden artery cut through stone, running cold while the sun burned everything above it. For a moment, he could almost hear the softened rush of water. Then a far-off sound lifted the hairs on his arms. A single hoof-fall struck stone, then another, then silence. Clara heard it too. Her eyes shifted to him, all question and no fear. "Let's keep moving," Elias said calmly. "Higher ridge, then we turn west." They climbed through a notch and into a country of broken tables and stair-step ledges. Shadows lengthened, and the wind turned fragrant with crushed sage. When they finally made camp, they chose a bowl sheltered on three sides by rock, with a thin skein of sky overhead where the first star would appear. Clara set a small, careful fire. Elias picketed the horses in a patch of tough grass and checked their hooves. They ate in companionable quiet. Coyotes sang from the far rim, not close, not distant, a chorus to the day's long labor. Clara spread her father's compass, the journal, and a small ruler across a flat stone, and began translating the afternoon's observations into lines and numbers. "You work like a surveyor," Elias said. "I work like a daughter who watched a good man draw truth from stubborn land," she answered, not looking up. Then, softer, "He would have liked this puzzle. He would have liked you." Ooh, the words landed with a modest warmth Elias did not know he had been missing. He reached for his canteen and took a measured sip. Beyond the bowl of their camp, the darkness stirred with the small, secret movements of the desert. He rose and climbed to the lip of the shelter, letting his eyes adjust. There it was, exactly where he dreaded and expected it. A faint orange thread far to the east, low and steady, too constant to be lightning and too early for dawn. A cook fire, banked small and careful, a patient man keeping himself from notice. Elias stood very still, weighing the distance, the angle of approach, the way the land might funnel a rider toward their position. He looked back at Clara, her head bent over the map, the firelight painting her features with quiet resolve. He climbed down without comment and settled by the flame. "We start before first light," he said. "Pack tight. Keep the journal tucked away unless you need it in your hands." Clara nodded, trusting the tone if not the explanation. Above them, the sky deepened to velvet, and the first star showed through the narrow seam of rock. Elias let the sound of the coyotes fade and the pulse of the day slow in his chest. Somewhere under their bedrolls, under the chalk and limestone and the patient bones of the hills, water moved unseen toward a canyon no engineer had yet named. Somewhere beyond that faint, stubborn fire, a rival marked their progress. Sleep, when it came, rode light on his shoulders. He dreamt of a river that shone without light, running in the dark as though time itself could not dull its gleam. The morning came without color, the kind of grey light that made every shadow seem deeper. Elias woke before Clara, listening for that faint crackle of movement in the stillness. Nothing but the soft breath of the horses and the gentle scrape of wind through the rocks. Even so, he knew the other campfire had not been a trick of the eye. They packed in silence, the air cool enough to sting their fingers. Clara stowed the Maddox journal in a waterproof pouch at the bottom of her satchel, securing it beneath layers of oilskin and spare cloth. Elias checked the cinches on both geldings twice before leading them out of the sheltered bowl. Their route that morning took them into a narrow pass choked with willow scrub and boulders worn smooth by long-vanished floods. The walls rose high on either side, streaked with mineral stains that glistened faintly in the dim light. Clara kept glancing upward, as though expecting to see the dark oval of a sinkhole yawning overhead. By midday, they reached the remains of an old mining camp. Time and weather had reduced it to a scattering of warped timbers, collapsed sluice boxes, and rusted tools half buried in the sand. A toppled stove lay on its side, near what had once been the cook tent, its iron surface pitted and flaking. Clara dismounted and began to walk the perimeter, eyes alert for any scrap that might match the journal's sketches. She stopped near a tall rock face where faint carvings marked the stone. Spirals again, though these were shallower, the work of a quick hand. "Maddox?" she asked. Elias crouched to study them. Could be. Or another man who heard the same stories and marked what he thought he saw. While Clara copied the markings into her notebook, Elias wandered toward the edge of the camp where the ground fell into a dry ravine. At the base of the slope, he found a strip of leather snagged on a mesquite branch. It was fresh, still supple, the cut edge too clean to be the work of weather. He palmed it, feeling the shape of a bootstrap in his mind, then tucked it into his coat. When he returned to Clara, he said nothing about it. There was no need to add to her unease. They followed the ravine westward until the sun tilted toward the horizon. The land began to change, the hardpan giving way to fractured limestone, the air carrying a faint dampness. Small trickles of water seeped from cracks in the rock, running only a few feet before vanishing into the ground. Clara knelt by one such flow, pressing her fingers into the cool trickle. "This is it," she murmured. "The surface feeders. They'll lead to the main channel." Elias watched the water disappear into a fissure no wider than a hand. "You're certain?" "I'm certain we're on the right vein. Maddox's marks point this way." As they made camp on a flat terrace above the ravine, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound Elias had not heard in years. The creak of leather under strain, the faint metallic tick of a spur striking stone. He scanned the ledges beyond their fire and caught a flicker of movement, a shape melting into shadow. Clara looked at him from across the flames. "What is it?" Elias reached for the coffee pot, his voice even. Just the wind, maybe an animal. But in his mind, the strip of leather in his pocket burned like a brand. Silas was close now. The only question was whether he would strike before they reached the river, or wait until Elias had done all the hard work of finding it. The night deepened, cold settling into their bones. Clara's fire cast a small circle of warmth in the wide, indifferent dark. Somewhere above them, the hidden waters of the lost river moved through black channels, silent and patient. Elias knew they were no longer following faded trails alone. The hunter was behind them, and the finish line lay ahead in a canyon neither of them had yet seen. The wind began as a whisper against the limestone, a low hum that made the horses twitch their ears. By the time they finished their morning coffee, it had risen to a restless push, scattering loose pebbles across the terrace. Elias studied the western sky and saw the bruise-colored wall of clouds building over the mesas. "We'll ride until it catches us," he said, tightening the cinch on his gelding. "Then we look for rock cover." They moved quickly, following the ravine as it twisted through narrow cuts and shallow drops. The air thickened with the smell of rain and something sharper, ozone, as if the sky itself were sharpening a blade. Clara kept the journal under her oilskin coat, one hand on the reins, the other gripping the saddle horn as the horses picked their way over the rough ground. The first drops came like tossed gravel, cold and stinging. Then the clouds opened and the world became a grey curtain. The limestone underfoot turned slick, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses. Elias's hat brim funneled water down his coat. Clara's hair darkened to black as it escaped its pins. Through the downpour, Elias spotted a dark slit in the rock face to their left. "There!" he shouted, and they scrambled toward it, guiding the horses into the narrow mouth of a cavern. Inside, the air was cool and dry, the stone walls glistening with the slow drip of water from unseen cracks. They tethered the horses near the entrance, giving them nosebags of oats, and moved deeper into the cave with their lantern. The light revealed a chamber no larger than a small room, its ceiling low, the floor littered with debris, fallen rock, brittle animal bones, the remnants of an old fire ring. Clara knelt beside the stones of the fire ring, brushing away dust. "Someone camped here a long time ago." Elias was only half listening. On the far wall, carved into the stone, was the spiral symbol again, deeper this time, its grooves darkened by age. Beside it, barely visible in the lantern glow, were crude lines that seemed to trace the course of a river, disappearing into a jagged crack. "Maddox was here," Elias murmured. Clara joined him, running her fingertips over the carving. "This is more than a mark. It's a map. A piece of it, anyway. Look, the spiral sits where the fissure begins, and this line," she traced it upward, "this could be the path underground." They studied it until the wind outside shifted, turning the rain into a solid roar. Somewhere above, thunder cracked so sharply that dust sifted from the cavern roof. Elias pulled a blanket from his pack and spread it on the dry floor. "We waited out," he said. "No sense breaking our necks on wet stone." Hours passed, the storm refusing to move on. Clara sketched the wall carving into her notebook, adding her own measurements to match the journal's scale. Elias dozed lightly, waking at each gust that howled into the cave mouth. Near dusk, the rain finally began to ease. Elias stepped outside to check the sky and froze. Far down the ravine, just visible through the thinning curtain of rain, a lone rider sat his horse on a rise, watching the cave. Even at this distance, Elias knew the set of those shoulders. Silas. When Elias turned back inside, Clara was packing their gear. "We can ride in another hour," she said, not noticing the tension in his face. Elias nodded, hiding the truth for now. Let Silas watch. Let him think they were only sheltering. Tomorrow they would move fast, and if the carving on the wall was right, they were closer to the lost river than they had ever been. They left the cave before first light, the sky a deep violet seam slowly opening to pale gold. The storm had scoured the land clean. Every crease in the limestone shone with a cold sheen. The air smelled of wet stone and sage. Elias set a hard pace while the ground held its grip. When the path steepened into stair-steps of chalky ledge, they dismounted and led the geldings, hooves clicking in a steady metronome that steadied the nerves even as the drop beside them widened. By mid-morning, the country changed from folded swales to sheer shelves. The ravine fell away into a trough where the world narrowed to a blade. A white crust traced the edges of shallow basins, proof that water had stood there and then gone to ground. Clara halted at one such basin and pressed her palm to the salt rim. "This is where the flow concentrates," she said. "When it spills over, it has to find a deeper seam." Elias listened. Beneath the usual mountain quiet, beneath wind and the scuff of leather, there was a sound like a distant kettle, with the lid held down. Not running water, not quite, Pressure, a living thing caged in stone. They climbed a rib of rock that brought them to a ledge as narrow as a fence rail. The wall above hung close enough to scrape a shoulder. The drop on the other side fell into a dim, tumbled chute. Elias tested each hold and placed his feet the way a man places words he cannot take back. Halfway along, the ledge crumbled under his boot. He pitched forward, striking the wall with his forearm, gravel clattering into the chute. For a breath, there was no breath. Clara dropped to a knee and drove the heel of her glove into a seam, anchoring herself. The coil of rope Thomas Avery had given them came off her shoulder in one smooth motion. She looped it around Elias's chest and hauled. He found a new hold, pushed, and felt the ledge settle under his weight again. When he stood safely, they stared at each other for a quiet second that contained a full ledger of things neither would say. Then they moved on. The ledge delivered them to a bench of broken slabs where fossils winked in the limestone like watchful eyes. Clara knelt, tracing the imprint of a leaf pressed into rock older than language. She glanced at the slope above. "Cast on top, hard shelf below," she said. "The river will carve where the stone is softest. If we find the line where that softness breaks, we find where it reappears." They skirted a scree cone that slithered at the touch of a boot. Elias kept his gaze moving. Twice he found signs that did not belong to wild land. A notch in a juniper at shoulder height, cut with a careful blade. A square nail half buried in dust. Neither was proof. Both were warning. At noon, they took shade in the lee of a standing block the size of a freight wagon. Clara unfolded the spyglass and swept the horizon. Far to the west, the mesas rose like battlements, their northern faces bitten by the same notch Maddox had drawn in his last careful hand. "There," she said, "that notch opens into a slot. If water vanished under us, it will seek daylight, where the stress has cracked the stone." Elias ate quietly, counting time by the slow drip of runoff from the block's shadowed edge. He kept seeing a rider paused against rain, a hat brim pulled low, a man who enjoyed the long game. When they rose, he circled the block once more. Behind it, tucked into shadow, lay a dead branch that had no right to be there, propped against a balanced rock. A trip prop. One kick would send a sheet of slabs sliding across their path. He eased the branch aside, lowered the slabs by hand, and scattered the telltale tracks with a twist of his boot. When he returned, Clara read his face. "We are not alone," she said. "No." Elias tightened the cinch and checked the bit. "But we are ahead." Afternoon sharpened the light to a hard white edge. They climbed through a notch, and the land opened all at once. Before them spread a long amphitheater where the floor sloped gently toward a darker seam. A line of cottonwoods stitched the seam like a scar healed in green. Even from this height, Elias saw movement that did not belong to wind, a shimmer like breath, mist lifting where sunlight touched a narrow ribbon. Clara raised the spyglass and did not speak for a long moment. When she lowered it, her voice was steady. "There is a canyon cut into the bedrock," she said. "Not wide, very deep. The trees follow it, and there is moisture rising. If the river resurfaces anywhere, it will be there." Elias felt it like a hand on the back of his neck, a pull that was not fate and not greed, but something older. He kept his own voice even. "How far can we reach before dark?" "We can make the rim," she said, "not the descent. That will require daylight and rope." They moved again, angling across the amphitheater, picking lines that kept them on firm stone. Twice they had to dismount and lead the geldings between knife-edged fins that rang like thin bells when the iron shoes brushed them. When the cottonwoods stood close enough to cast shade over the horses' necks, the air changed. It grew cooler, the smell of limestone giving way to the scent of wet leaves and cold mineral. Elias heard it then, faint but no longer imagined. Water, deep-set and tight-throated, running where no eyes could watch it run. They reached the rim as the sun laid a copper bar along the far mesas. The canyon yawned in front of them, a slot so narrow that the light at the bottom looked like a thread pulled through cloth. 30 yards to their right, the stone bulged into a natural buttress that would take an anchor. Below, far below, water flashed once, then vanished in shade. Clara stood with her hands braced on her knees, eyes bright in the last light. She opened the journal and mapped the view in quick strokes. Elias walked the rim, testing the bedding planes with the ferrule of his staff, marking the points where rope would bite clean. On the far side, at a flat point in the rim rock, he saw it again. A small, well-tended circle of ash and a few horse droppings crushed into the dust to hide their shape. A camp made and erased by a careful man. When he returned to Clara, dusk had thinned the world to outlines. "We do not descend tonight," he said. "We eat, we sleep, we set one watch. First light, we anchor here and go down." She nodded, already packing the journal. "Silas?" "He is within a mile," Elias said. "Maybe less. He will let us find the surest way. He will take the map and the claim if he can. He will try for both without a fight if the land can do his work." They chose a hollow back from the rim, screened by low juniper and a spill of rock. Clara set a small fire that gave heat without light. Elias staked the horses where they could crop the thin grass and still raise an alarm at a stranger's approach. They ate in quiet, and when they spoke it was only to name tasks for morning, to measure rope, to count rings on the anchor stones in the buttress above the slot. Night settled. A poor will called from somewhere in the rocks and fell silent. Elias took the first watch, sitting with his back to the juniper, rifle across his knees. The canyon breathed below, a steady whisper that matched his own lung and heart. He stared into the dark until the dark settled inside him, and he knew with a certainty that filled his chest that the river existed here as something more than a legend. It was near enough to touch. It would give up its line to those who had the patience to mark it and the care to survive it. Near midnight, he woke Clara for the second watch. She took his place with a nod, her face calm, her eyes clear. Elias rolled into his blanket and let the sounds of the canyon draw him down. Just before sleep took him, he thought he heard a stone tick against another stone at the edge of camp, a small sound in a vast night. He kept still. The sound did not come again. Morning would bring the descent. Morning would bring the river into the light and draw every rival toward the same narrow rim. Between now and then, the mountain held them both in a palm of stone. At first light, the canyon was a wound in the earth, its depth still holding the blue shadow of night. Mist clung to the cottonwoods like strips of gauze, and the air smelled of stone so cold it seemed to steal the breath. Elias and Clara worked in silence, uncoiling the heavy rope and checking each length for fray. The buttress they had marked the night before rose solid and clean, its top worn smooth by centuries of wind. Elias drove the first iron spike deep into a natural crack and tested it with his full weight. The metal rang in the stone like a muted bell. Clara fed the rope through a steel ring, her movements brisk, eyes darting occasionally to the rim beyond their camp. "You think he's close?" she asked without looking up. "Close enough to see us go down," Elias replied. "Close enough to choose his moment." The descent was narrow and awkward, a slanting crack that fell nearly straight for the first 20 feet before easing into a chute of stacked boulders. Elias went first, feeling each step and testing each hold before trusting his weight to it. Clara followed, lowering herself with the sure, deliberate movements of someone used to high shelves and steep trails. Halfway down, the sound changed. The whisper of the river grew into a steady rush, echoing in the confined space. When they reached the floor of the canyon, they stood on a ledge, scarcely wider than the length of a horse, the water sliding past in a channel no more than 5 feet across. It was shockingly clear, tinted pale green by the light filtering down. Clara crouched and dipped her fingers. Cold, fast, and she lifted her hand to show a glint between her fingertips. Gold dust. This is the same flow Maddox must have tracked. Elias knelt beside her, scanning the water's course. The river appeared from under a limestone overhang and vanished again into a darker slit 30 yards downstream. On the walls above that exit were faint carvings, not just spirals, but arrow shapes pointing toward side cracks too small for a person to enter. He took out the journal and began marking the angles of the canyon, the overhang, the slit. Clara paced the length of the accessible bank, counting steps, measuring depth with a weighted cord. They worked without speaking, each movement adding a piece to the map that would claim the gold as theirs. The first sign of danger was the hiss of grit striking the water. Elias looked up to see small stones pattering down from the rim above. At first it could have been natural, the crumble of weathered rock. Then a larger stone bounced once, twice, and landed so close to Clara that the splash wet her boots. Elias's eyes found the source, a shadow on the rim, briefly outlined against the morning sky. Silas. He scanned the wall above them and spotted movement in the chute they had descended. A rope, not theirs, was sliding down in silence. Whoever followed was using the same anchor points. "Clara," Elias said quietly, "pack the instruments." She obeyed without question, her face calm but tight. Elias tied their own rope to a second anchor point at the base of the ledge and swung it into the current. The water seized it instantly, pulling it toward the downstream slit. "What are you—" "If they come down here, they'll be between us and the way up. We take the water. It will carry us to the next open chamber, maybe farther. It's a gamble, but it's ours to make." Clara hesitated only a breath before securing her satchel across her chest. Together they stepped into the current, letting the icy grip take them. The river yanked them into the slit, the world narrowing to black stone and roaring water. For a few blinding seconds there was nothing but the rush of cold, the scrape of rock against their shoulders, and the absolute knowledge that they were beyond control. Then the channel widened, light flared ahead, and they were spat into a pool so clear they could see the gravel on its floor. They scrambled onto a bank littered with water-polished stones. The canyon here was broader, the walls streaked with iron red and moss green. Above them, no rim was in sight, only the open sky, far enough that no voice could carry. Clara wrung water from her hair and glanced back at the chute they had come through. "We just bought ourselves a lead." Elias smiled grimly, "and lost them the easy way down." He looked at the pool, at the gentle spill of water running out through another gap in the stone. Every bend was a choice they had to make before Silas found another way down. They shouldered their packs and began following the river's downstream path, deeper into a country no map had ever claimed. The canyon opened like a great throat swallowing the morning, its walls smoothed by centuries of hidden weather. The river ran tight beside them, swift and cold, a green blade threading between shelves of purple limestone. Elias set a pace that made conversation spare. Each turn of the channel had to be measured, each bend sketched tight enough that a surveyor's eye could find it again without the mercy of memory. Clara moved with practiced efficiency, calling out bearings, chalking quick symbols on flat faces, translating flow and rock into the language of lines. Her father's compass swung steady against her wrist. When the path pinched, Elias took the lead and shouldered their way through, testing ledges with his weight, lowering packs by rope, choosing soundstone over speed where the choice could be made at all. Signs of older hands began to appear, ghost marks laid down when the West was a rumor and maps were prayers. They found a timber peg swollen tight into a drill hole above a pool, the wood black with age. Farther on, a small triangle chiseled chest-high pointed toward a side crack, no wider than a man's shoulder. Clara slid her lantern inside and drew it back with a thoughtful frown. "Air is moving," she said. "There is void behind that seam." "Another passage," Elias answered, studying the grade. "Too tight to crawl with gear. Maddox may have sounded it and kept to the main line." They pressed on. At a dogleg turn, the canyon eased into a shelf of gravel, where the water slowed enough to show its secret. In the eddy, gold dust drifted in slow wheels of current, turning in small suns before slipping back into the current. Clara cupped a palmful, then let it fall, refusing to keep even a souvenir that would slow their hands. "This is the spine of the story," she said softly. "He was right. Your dying miner, Maddox, all of them." Elias nodded once. The proof was not the sparkle, but the shape of the country matching the old marks. He made a careful sketch of the eddy line and the notch that fed it, then looked up at a sound that did not belong to water. It came thin at first, a thread from far above, then steadier. Pebbles rattled from a crack in the sunlit rim 200 feet overhead, pattering in a lazy fan that kissed the water and died. Elias's gaze followed the angle to a flat ledge on the eastern wall. There, for an instant, a figure crossed between light and shadow, not hurried, not careless. A man using a higher traverse, perhaps with a guide who knew the country. Clara saw his face sharpen. Silas, or his hand. Elias studied the walls again. "There is an old stock trail up there. Someone remembered it. That gives him speed," she said. "We have accuracy. We keep both." He closed the journal and slung it across his chest. "Move." The canyon deepened into a corridor where the sound gathered until it was a pressure against the ribs. Here, the limestone changed to bedded layers that snapped clean at the touch of a hammer. Elias used the pick end to carve shallow ticks at decision points, low enough that a casual glance from the rim would miss them. Clara paused at each fork long enough to shoot a bearing and note the grade of the floor by rule and eye. At mid-afternoon, they reached a chamber, vaulted like a chapel. Stalactites drooped from a lip of darker stone, and on the far wall a series of faint cuts made a ladder of nicked steps. Beneath the lowest, a rusted pan lay half-buried in gravel. Elias lifted it with both hands, feeling the ghost of weight that gold once gave it. "Someone worked here long enough to try and stay," he said. Then the water shifted, and he could not follow. Clara set the pan down with care, or he found the exit and never needed to come back. They climbed the nicked steps and edged along a balcony barely 2 boots wide. From that height, they could see the water entering the chamber through a carved slot, hitting the pool in a jet that fanned silver. The outlet on the far side ran under a fallen slab and then out of sight. Clara measured the drop and the angle of the slab's bedding plane, her pencil moving in short, sure strokes. A hawk's cry drifted into the chamber, thin and fierce. Elias turned toward the slice of sky and caught a brief flash on the rim. Sun on glass, someone signaling or checking a sight with a mirror. He felt the old cold calm settle over his limbs, the one that came when a hunt turned into a contest, decided by craft rather than will. "We will not outclimb the rim," he said. "We will outrun it underground." The outlet tunnel took them on hands and knees for 10 yards, their packs pushed ahead. When it widened, the air grew cooler and smelled faintly of damp earth rather than raw stone. The grade softened. The voice of the river changed from rush to a layered murmur. They emerged at last on a sloping bench where the canyon put on a skin of green. Ferns clung to the walls, and the light where it reached came rich as honey. Clara lifted the spyglass and angled it toward a bright seam to the west. The lens caught a ribbon of trees arcing in a crescent beyond the next bend. Her breath hitched with a sound as close to joy as the trail allowed. "That is a true spring line," she said. "If the underground course rises anywhere accessible, it will be there. We can map from the inside out and claim the line entire." Elias listened. Somewhere behind the curve of stone, a loose rock clicked where no hoof should be, then settled. He marked the bench with a small cross and a date, closed the journal, and tightened the strap across his chest. "Then we reach it before the light is gone," he said, "and we sleep with our backs to the claim." They moved together. No wasted motion now, each obstacle met with a practiced hand. When the canyon finally uncurled, the sight waiting for them was clean as a promise kept. A sheet of water sprang from a black seam halfway up the wall, veiling down into a pool lined with pale sand. A broad apron of wet stone led away from the spill, and on it, trapped in thin drifts like seeds after a wind, lay flakes and wires of gold. Clara set her palm to the wet rock and closed her eyes as if hearing a name. Elias stood guard, watching the angles, the ledges, the rim. Far above, a hawk wheeled and stooped, then rose again, patient, relentless. "Map it," he said quietly. "Every line." Clara knelt and began, the pencil hissing across the page, the compass ticking a perfect circle. Elias counted the beats of the river, the measured work of their hands, and the slow approach of a rival whose timing had never been luck. When the last note was taken and the last angle fixed, the sun had turned the high rim to copper. They backed into a hollow screened by willow and set a dark fire that would not betray their place. Night would bring choices. A man like Silas would not try the water. He would choose the rim, the gun, the sudden reach of a rope dropped clean from above. Elias laid his rifle across his thighs and listened to the river tell its patient truth. The map in Clara's satchel was nearly whole. The claim waited in Horace Blackwell's polished hand. Between the two stood a single line he could not redraw, drawn straight through whatever dawn would bring. The morning came soft, the air thick with the cool scent of willow and wet stone. Mist drifted in thin ribbons above the pool, curling away into the high light. Elias rose first, moving without noise, scanning the rim where shadows lingered in the notches and folds. No movement yet, but that absence was its own message. Silas would wait for the ground to work in his favor. Clara emerged from the willows with her satchel slung tight and her father's compass already in hand. Her eyes went straight to the spill of water. "We finished the record today," she said. "Every measurement, every bearing." Elias nodded. They worked with quiet precision, tracing the spring to the point where it vanished again under the wall. Clara plotted its line against the symbols from Maddox's journal, aligning each curve with the features they had passed. The spiral sinkholes, the narrow slots, the green seam in the amphitheater. The picture was whole now. The lost river, not as legend, but as a line of truth a surveyor could follow with his eyes closed. When the last stroke was drawn, Clara sat back on her heels and let the pencil fall. "It's here," she said softly. "All of it. This is the claim." Elias took the pages, studying the map until it was burned into his mind. "Now we get it out before someone takes it." They broke camp quickly, but Elias led them not down the canyon's easy slope toward the open country, but up a narrow chute of stone where the river's voice dimmed with each step. Clara understood without asking. The obvious way out was the one Silas would expect. The chute was steep, the rocks slick where moss clung in shaded pockets. Twice Elias anchored the rope so Clara could climb without risk. They reached a shoulder of rock that overlooked the pool from high above. From there they saw what their caution had earned them, a lone rider on the opposite rim, hat brim low, glass glinting once in the sun. Silas. He didn't move to follow. He simply sat his horse, watching, the kind of stillness that told Elias he was measuring not just distance, but intent. Elias gave no sign of seeing him, turning instead to guide Clara along the ridgeline until the pool was lost behind a bend of stone. The land beyond was rough and rising, carved by side gullies that forced them to choose their steps carefully. Midway across a saddle of rock, Clara paused. "Elias," she said, pointing to the ground. In the dust lay a single horseshoe print, sharp-edged, fresh. Elias crouched, reading its story. A shod horse, light rider, moving at a walk. Silas had found another way down, or sent someone ahead. "We keep west," Elias decided. "The mesas will cover us until we're close to town." The rest of the day was a test of endurance. The sun burned the stone white, and the heat radiated from the ground in waves. They rationed water carefully, speaking little, saving their strength for the climb out of the high country. By late afternoon, they reached a notch that opened onto the long slope of the lower basin. From here, the trail would carry them to the flats, where the railroad's line gleamed faintly in the distance. Clara stopped to take one last bearing, aligning the compass with the mesa notch they had first seen days ago. Full circle. she murmured. Elias scanned the open ground ahead. Not yet. We still have to walk this map into Blackwell's hand. They started down the slope, their shadows stretching long across the stone. Behind them, on the rim they had just left, a rider appeared for a moment, black against the gold of the setting sun. Then he was gone, swallowed by the land, as silent as the river that had hidden its gold for so many years. The basin spread wide before them, a flat plain of pale grass rippling under a restless wind. Elias kept them to a faint cattle trail, knowing the low swales offered at least a little cover from eyes watching the horizon. The light was turning honey gold, the sun drifting toward the jagged line of the western hills. By the time they reached the last rise before the flats, both horses were blowing hard. Elias pulled them up short, scanning the lay of the land. The trail bent into a shallow cut here, the kind of place a man could disappear until the moment he chose to strike. He saw the sign almost at once, a faint scatter of small stones on the slope, as if disturbed by a boot sliding into position. His hand dropped to the rifle at his side. "Clara," he said evenly, "stay with the horses and keep low." Before she could answer, a voice came from the shadows of the cut. "You've been carrying something for me, Boone." Silas Kincaid stepped into view, his long coat moving with the wind, one hand resting on the butt of his revolver. Behind him, two men emerged from the rocks, each carrying a carbine. Their stance was loose but deliberate, men who had done this before. "You should have stayed on the rim," Elias said, "and let you walk into town with the river in your pocket?" Silas's grin was thin as wire. "No, I'll take it here. No crowds, no law. Just us." Clara's voice was calm, but Elias heard the steel in it. "You won't get it from me." Silas's eyes flicked to her, then back to Elias. "She can ride on. No harm if you hand me the journal." Elias shifted his weight just enough to ground his feet. "And if I don't?" Silas's smile faded. "Then you won't be riding anywhere." For a long moment the wind filled the silence, tugging at coats, whispering over stone. Then Elias moved, quick and sharp, swinging the rifle from his shoulder. The crack of the shot shattered the air, striking the ground at the boots of the man to Silas's left. The startled jump broke their formation just enough for Elias to dive toward the nearest boulder, rolling into cover as Clara yanked both horses hard downslope. Gunfire answered, sharp, flat echoes bouncing through the cut. Chips of rock stung Elias's cheek. He returned fire once, twice, forcing the two men to keep low. Silas stayed upright, moving with slow precision along the ridge, his revolver steady. Clara looped the horses behind the cover of a low rise and scrambled back, her father's compass clutched in one hand, the satchel strapped tight across her chest. She dropped beside Elias, breath quick but eyes steady. "They're trying to pin us." "Not if we move first," Elias said. He fired again, then motioned her toward the far end of the cut. They moved low and fast, keeping to the shadows, slipping out of the narrow channel before Silas could shift to block them. When they cleared the rocks, Elias swung into the saddle and hauled Clara up behind him. They rode hard, the horses stretching into the flat with every muscle straining. Shots rang out behind them, but the distance grew with each pounding stride. The basin blurred into a wash of grass and shadow, the railroad line drawing closer, the faint outline of the town beyond it glowing in the last light. Elias didn't slow until the first lanterns of Whitlock Junction winked into sight. Only then did he look back. The cut was empty. Silas had not followed. Not yet. But Elias knew the man well enough to be certain. The game wasn't over. It had only changed its ground. Whitlock Junction simmered with heat and rumor when Elias and Clara rode in. Horace Blackwell waited on the station platform with 2 attorneys and a crate for a desk, his gold chain bright as a beacon. Elias dismounted at the edge of the crowd. Clara stepped forward, unwrapped the folio, and placed it in Horace's hand. Measurements, bearings, cross-sections, spring index. The map told the river's story from first disappearance to first return a man could stand beside. Horace turned each page slowly. The amphitheatre, the slot, the laddered chamber, the spill and apron where fine gold settled in thin fans. Calculation tightened his eyes. He looked to his attorneys. "The conditioners posted," he said. The elder lawyer read from a single page. A deed conveyed upon receipt of a functional map defining a continuous, reproducible course of the lost river, measured to surveyor's standard, from first disappearance to first re-emergence, accessible on foot. He set the paper down. "The folio meets the condition," a voice carried from the freight office steps. He did not meet it alone. Silas Kincaid stood in the doorway, hat in hand, two men behind him, dust still on their coats. "I rode the rim," he said. "My men took bearings. I claim joint credit." Elias faced him. "You shadowed. You did not map. You tried to take a book, not the line." Silas's smile thinned. "Care without claim is a story told for free." Clara spoke clearly. "We will reproduce the course at dawn. Every angle closes." The crowd shifted. Horace let the murmur die, then drew out a folded parchment with a red wax seal. "Mr. Boone," he said, "sign your acceptance." Silas moved a step. The deputy lifted a hand, and he halted. Horace slid the deed across the crate. Elias signed with slow steadiness. Horace countersigned and pressed the seal deep. The attorneys added their attestations. Elias turned and placed the parchment in Clara's satchel. "Carry it," he said. "It fits you better than me." Silas exhaled a short laugh. "You think a seal ends a race? Races have a way of circling back." Horace's voice hardened. "Your claim has not been proved. The town has witnessed a promise kept." Silas tipped his hat without warmth and stepped down to the street. No one stopped him. No one cleared his path. The platform loosened its breath. A few cheers, hands thrust toward Elias and Clara, the bright clatter of a cornet warming a march. It did not quite begin. Clara leaned close. "We should be gone before dusk." They left the boards for the shadow of the freight house, past the water tank's cool drip. Elias kept one hand on the satchel, feeling the soft heat of paper against cloth. The public act was complete. The private risks were not. They crossed to Thomas Avery's barn by the back lane. He met them at the door, ushered horse and rider inside, and dropped the bar. "Sign it?" he asked. Elias nodded. "Signed and sealed." Thomas looked toward the street. "Then you'll want quiet until morning." "We'll post the route at dawn," Clara said. "No debate once the bearings match." Thomas set bedrolls in the loft and a kettle on the stove. "You can sleep here," he said, "and leave when first light finds the rails." Outside, the town resumed its hum. Inside, the barn held stillness and the smell of clean hay. Elias sat with his back to a stall and listened to the horses settle. The deed lay in Clara's keeping. The river lay on paper. Night lay between promise and proof. He closed his eyes and let the quiet take him. Dawn lifted like a curtain. Elias, Clara, and Thomas walked to the platform, with the town still rubbing sleep from its eyes. Horace arrived with one attorney and a single sheet, the posted condition. Clara set her compass on the crate and opened the folio to the first page. "From the notch," she said, "bearing 212 degrees to the amphitheatre seam." She walked the platform edge as if it were rimrock, calling angles, naming features, laying the underground line across sunlit boards. Elias followed, matching her notes to the land a surveyor could see. The notch in the mesa, the shelf above the slot, the spring apron. The attorney checked the closures with a rule and pencil. He nodded once. "The course reproduces." Horace turned to the few gathered faces. "The claim stands." Elias exhaled the long breath he had been holding since the first challenge. He looked at Clara. "Your father would have liked the work." She closed the folio and slid it into the satchel. "He would have liked the company." By noon, the pair had a small office above the assay, a desk for the maps, and a safe for the deed. Elias refused the whiskey pressed on him and asked instead for a ledger. On the first line he wrote, "Clara Porter, equal partner." On the second, "School fund, 10% of first-year receipts. Thomas added his name under retainer, a quiet promise to keep watch. When the dust of the day settled, Elias walked alone to the rail yard. The track ran straight into blue distance. Beyond it, the country he and Clara had crossed rose in layered stone and light. He thought of the dying miner's whisper, of Maddox's marks, of a map that began as rumor and became a measured truth. Footsteps sounded behind him. Clara joined him at the fence, hands on the top rail. "Silas?" she asked. "He'll surface when the ground suits him." They stood in companionable silence until a local train slid in, brakes sighing, iron shining like water at noon. Children waved from a caboose ladder. An old couple on the platform smiled without speaking. Elias touched the brim of his hat. "There's work enough ahead," he said. "A river to steward, a town to help, maps to finish." Clara nodded. "And students to teach why maps matter." Evening found them back at Thomas's barn for a plain supper. After, Elias stepped outside. The first star burned above the water tank, bright and steady. In his mind, the lost river moved as it always had, quiet under stone, certain of its course. For the first time in years, he felt the same. Tomorrow they would ride to the spring and post markers so any honest prospector could follow and keep clear. Tomorrow they would hire hands, lay out safe paths, and keep the claim in order. Tonight, the town was still, and the promise was kept. The river had been found, the deed delivered, and a life turned from chasing to keeping. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the gold we set out to find, but the bonds we forge, the lessons we learn, and the courage we discover along the way. If this journey through the Lost River stirred something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation alive. And if you want more stories that bring the Old West to life, filled with heart, grit, and unexpected turns, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next adventure.